Buyurun hocam.
Dear participants, hi. Welcome to the 26th Science and Society meeting, which is organized by Istanbul Commerce University. This is Professor Dr. Tuğba Karabulut, and I am honored that today we have a very important guest, Professor Dr. Kim Cameron from University of Michigan, and he'll be talking about organizational culture and leadership, and he will explain their effects on company success. And our Vice Rector, Elçin Hoca, is going to make the opening speech. Thank you very much, Elçin Hoca, and welcome, Professor Cameron.
Thank you very much, Professor Karabulut, and thank you very much, Professor Cameron. We are very pleased to host you in our university, in our Science and Society Meetings webinar. Today, our webinar's title is Organization Culture and Leadership, the Effect of Company Success. As we know, Professor Cameron's main research field is organizations and organization culture and leadership, especially. Also, from our books, from our classes, we know there are 4 types of organizational culture. Those are a clan culture, autocracy culture, hierarchy culture, market culture. And this is your contribution to this field. We will have the opportunity to listen you in this webinar. On behalf of our students, our academicians, I want to thank you very much for this valuable interview opportunity. And also, as we told just a few minutes ago, I would like to say you welcome, and also I want to invite you to our university and to Istanbul whenever you want, whenever you are available. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And thank you for this interview. Welcome.
I'm so delighted and flattered to be invited. I appreciate very much the chance to come. I mentioned just before we started recording that there was one time in my life that I have, and this was probably 10 or 15 years ago, that I had a chance to visit Istanbul for 2 or 3 days. It was a delight. I'd like to come back sometime. Let me give you a little bit of background about how this focus on organizational culture came to be. So I was in the midst at the time of studying the question, how do you determine if an organization is effective? Now, that's a very easy question to answer in the profit sector. That is, are you making money or not? Is stock price going up or not? Is market share going up or not? Are we growing or not? But in the not-for-profit sector, and for example, with universities, it's a much more difficult question to answer. For example, is Istanbul Ticaret University more or less effective than, say, the London Business School, or than the University of Michigan, or than INSEAD in Paris? I mean, how would you answer that question? Sort of depends on where you live, and especially it depends on what kind of criteria you use, and whether or not anybody would agree with those criteria. So that was actually the challenge. How do you determine if an organization is effective when there really isn't consensual bottom line performance indicators? Well, we did lots of research. It was more than just me, but during that period of time, we did lots of research on organizations. And one of the things that emerged from that research was, excuse me, that some organizations are especially effective if they are stable, controlled, predictable. I mean, the stock market will punish a company if they don't know what's going to happen to stock price next year. I mean, there has to be some predictability. If I have no idea what's going to happen to Apple computer stock, I probably won't buy it. So predictability and control and so on, standardization and whatnot is understandable. However, we discovered some other organizations who were almost exactly the opposite. They were effective because they were dynamic, entrepreneurial, changing, flexible. Well, that creates an axis anchored by two opposite, or what we referred to as competing values. On the one hand, control and predictability. On the other hand, dynamism, unpredictability, change, flexibility. Well, in addition to that, we discovered some organizations are effective if they are focused primarily on internal processes, internal dynamics, keeping things well-oiled inside the organization, and very efficient. No surprise. I mean, if we can't afford mistakes, we can't afford to have crazy things going on. We need a structured, rational, routine environment. Then we're effective. We produce the products that people expect us to, or the outcomes. On the other hand, there were other organizations, other types of organizations we discovered, which were opposite from that. That is, they were effective because they were so good at managing external environmental activities. That is, they weren't focused at all on the internal dynamics. Well, they were focused less on the internal dynamics and much more on making sure that they were competitive in the marketplace. They had created market niches. They had strategic positions in their industry, and they were able to predict the environment and so on. Well, that creates another axis, anchored on the one hand by a focus on internal dynamics, on the other hand by external dynamics. So you put those two axes together, it creates a 2x2 figure. No surprise, most academics try to create something with 2x2 matrix. Well, what's interesting about that resulting figure, anchored by opposites, and we labeled that a competing values framework. What's interesting about that framework is, and it was the first academic article we published in an academic journal was 1982. So we've been doing research on this for 40 plus years. Well, there's been a number of really interesting findings that have emerged from this framework. One of them is that the framework itself has been duplicated in a whole variety of different disciplines: biology, cognitive science, anthropology, astronomy, and organization structure, and so on. That is, you end up seeing something similar to this in a whole lot of different disciplines. And what it reminded us of is that there is sort of, in fact, in cognitive science, I have a colleague who spent his career essentially trying to say your brain is wired to have 4 different categories in which it places information and material and input. And he labeled them, and they're pretty similar to the competing values framework. So it would suggest to me that there's a certain amount of robustness in those dimensions. Now, it's not perfect, and it's not the only thing, of course, but I've been quite surprised that this model has been relatively robust in predicting phenomena in a variety of different circumstances. Well, one of the things that it predicts is something we refer to as an organization's culture. Now, what in the world are we talking about when we talk about organizational culture? Well, at the very simplistic, fundamental level, people just define organization culture as the way things are around here. It's the values, it's the assumptions, it's the way we interpret information, and so on. there's kind of at least for me, interesting way to think about culture, because my friend Ed Schein at MIT was the one that created this little triangle. In the very bottom of the triangle are what he refers to as implicit assumptions. I mean, we didn't wake up today, each of us, consciously saying, well, maybe I think I'll get dressed today. I mean, we just do. That's sort of the way things are around here. I didn't wake up, you did. I didn't wake up today making a conscious decision to speak English. And it's just what we do. That is, they're implicit assumptions that describe pretty accurately what kind of conditions we live in. All right, a little bit up on that triangle, Ed Schein's triangle, are norms, expectations, rules, and procedures. I mean, you know, in the United States, we drive on the left-hand side of the road. I actually don't know which side of the road you drive on in Istanbul, but that's a rule, and it sort of defines. I mean, in Great Britain, it's the opposite side of the road. In Japan, it's the opposite side of the road from the United States. So there are procedures and rules. You know, there's when we get on Zoom, we turn our mics off so we don't interrupt, and they're just procedures and expectations. That is more visible. And the differentiation between the very bottom of the pyramid and the next is we can see and observe and therefore change the norms and expectations. At the very top of that pyramid are behaviors. That is, it's the way we behave, it's the things we do, and so on. And of course, very observable. Now, what's important is if we are to change culture in an organization, if we just change behavior, we will not get culture change. That is, things will revert right back to the norm, to the way we just expect them, despite the interventions at the top, despite the commands from the leader, and so on. That is, to change culture, we have to change all the way down to implicit assumptions. I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by that. So, I was doing research in a company. There happened to be an automobile company. And I was talking to one of the senior executives who described described an event that happened in Toyota. So I'll name the company. So in this particular company, this executive, who happened to be in Ford Motor Company, an American company, visiting a Japanese company, he said he went through the plant. It was a wide aisle tour, just walking down the aisles looking at things. And it was, you know, freshly painted, crisp uniforms, and all the employees, everybody had a smile on their face and so on. He said, this is baloney. I don't believe that this is real. So he broke away from the group, went in and sat down next to some operators, that is, some blue collar workers. Talked to one fellow and he said, how long have you worked here? The fellow said, well, I've worked here for 24 years. He said, what's changed in 24 years? This fellow said, well, a lot has changed in this company. The whole culture has changed. For example, he said, I used to go home at night many years ago, chuckling to myself at the things I was thinking up to do to just mess up the system. For example, he said, in the frame of a car, there are hollow places that are welded shut, and it's for strength purposes. He said, I would put a couple of loose screws in that compartment so that 2 or 3 weeks later, a customer would be driving down the road couldn't figure out where that rattle would be coming from. It'd be all through the frame of the car. It would be my bolts or my screws in that compartment. Nobody will ever find it, he said. And I was just chuckling, look what I've done. Now, he said, we have a whole different culture. He said, we have flattened the organization markedly so that we used to have literally 150 different job classifications. We've reduced that down to 6. I mean, there are only 6 different classifications of workers. So as a result of that, he said, we've given everyone a business card, and we can make up our own title. And we get our own business cards with our own title. For me, he said, my title is Director of Welding Improvement. Now, what does that mean? That means his job was to check the robots that where the frame of the car goes down a line. You've seen pictures of it welding that frame together. That's his job, Director of Welding Improvement. He said, now when I go to a shopping mall or an athletic event or something in the parking lot, I look for the cars that we build. And when I find one, I take out my business card and write on that business card, I made your car. Any problems, call me. And I put that card under the windshield wiper. So how do you get a guy to shift from leaving bolts and screws in the compartment to make sure that there's something wrong to owning every single car that he finds? Well, that's a fundamental culture change because it changes the whole way he thinks about what his job is. Implicit assumptions. All right, so this competing values framework, we've developed an instrument. It happens to be the most used instrument in the world for measuring culture. And the instrument simply identifies the extent to which organizations emphasize different areas of this competing values framework. So when you put these dimensions together and you get a 4-quadrant model, there's no right answer. There's no one that's better than the others. They're just different depending on the challenges and circumstances of the organization. So we create a profile. It's not just one, no organization is just one of those quadrants, but they emphasize, 90% of organizations across the world emphasize one quadrant more than the others, or 1 or 2 quadrants more than the others. So you can identify a dominant culture. And then that, of course, leads to the question, well, okay, if I like my culture, fine, but if I don't, how do I change it? And that then opens up a whole lot of other questions about organizational culture and change and leadership and so on. So the research that has emerged out of the competing values framework has led to a lot of other research questions that help to make it applicable, help us use that framework to make changes to help organizations get better. Now, let me stop talking. That's a lot of talking. But let me check with you. Can you understand me when I talk?
Sure, we can understand.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, great. Because sometimes if I speak too rapidly or slur my words or talk too much like an American, people say, I can't understand what you're saying. Okay.
No, you're fine. We understand very well. And could you please explain 4 dimensions? You said, there are 4 dimensions of culture. Could you please explain each of them to us?
Thank you, I will. So if we draw this 2x2 model, in the lower left-hand corner, where it's internal focus and control focus. We have simply labeled that quadrant. In fact, we labeled it on the basis of organization theory and the labels that had been used to describe those kinds of organizations. And the label used in organization theory is a hierarchy or a hierarchical form of organizing. We've also attached a verb to that quadrant that captures its major focus, which has to do with control. So we sort of focus on an organization or a culture that has a major emphasis on control, stability, hierarchical processes, and so on. So lower left-hand quadrant is a hierarchy or control quadrant. Diagonally, upper right-hand quadrant, that is almost exactly the opposite. It's a competing values culture. Because in the upper right-hand corner, which has to do with flexibility and dynamism and an external focus, the word in the academic literature that describes that is an adhocracy. That's a jargonish word, but you know what an ad hoc team is. I mean, you put a group of people together, they solve a problem, you dissolve the team. It's an ad hoc group. Adhocracy is a variant on that because it has to do with dynamism and flexibility and so on. Entrepreneurship, creating a future as opposed to just responding or reacting to a future. So adhocracy, or in other words, the verb is create. Difference between control and create. That's that diagonal dimension as competing values. Upper left-hand quadrant is called well, in the academic literature, it's called a clan form of organizing. So many years ago, especially when Asian companies, and especially Japan, were kind of taken over the world's market share in consumer electronics and automobiles and so on. That has since diminished markedly. But people did lots of research trying to understand what was going on in those organizations. And what they discovered is, in that research, is that, for example, if you look at an American automobile company, General Motors, and count the number of levels in the hierarchy from the CEO to the floor sweeper, the custodian, there were 14 levels in the hierarchy. Well, in Japanese automobile company, Honda, for example, there are only 7, half the number. It's just a flatter organization, which means span of control. At General Motors, the span of control is between 6 and 7 people reporting to a single manager. In Honda, it's 46. Well, how do you manage 46 people? Well, you glue them together like a family. It's a clan kind of an organization structure. That's in the upper left-hand quadrant. And the verb that we use to highlight the major focus is collaboration, or a collaborate quadrant. Opposite from that, lower right, competing value. In the academic literature, the word is market form of organizing. I mean, one of the classic books in organization theory was entitled Markets and Hierarchies. It was written by Oliver Williamson. He won a Nobel Prize for economics, as it turns out, because transaction cost economics emerged out of that work. He was essentially saying, look, for 50 years, everybody has been focusing on hierarchy or control. But there really is another way to think about organizing. And he labeled it a market mechanism. Doesn't mean marketing, it means the marketplace. You have internal, external customers, you have competitive dynamics, and things are not the same as just stable control. So the verb is compete. It's a competitive stance. That is hard driving, whip crapping, get the numbers, you have to win in the marketplace. It's a focus on winning. All right. So we end up with having, I'll use verbs, a control, compete, collaborate, create quadrant. Diagonals are opposite or competing, and all organizations have some elements of each of those quadrants, but 90% of organizations will be dominated by one or more of those. And that has big implications for what kind of leadership is most effective, what kind of change strategies ought to be put into place, what kind of incentive systems people respond to, and so on. In other words, there's lots of reasons to try to understand what our organization is like. Especially it's the case when organizations merge or acquire others. We have this, at least for me, I think it's an interesting study. What we've discovered is, let's say one firm buys another or they merge together. What we've discovered is cultural compatibility, or what we refer to as cultural congruence, predicts performance. The more congruent the cultures, the higher the performance. Now, that doesn't mean exactly a match, by no means, but it means the more congruence we can find, the better. Now, one other implication. All organizations have subcultures. So if I walk into a big organization, my guess is the subculture in the accounting department will not be the same as the subculture in design engineering or in marketing or in the stamping plant or in HR. That is, every unit would have its own culture. But if, for example, I'm in Toyota versus Mercedes-Benz, I know I'm not in the same company. I mean, accounting is going to have its own subculture in both cases, but there is a core that glues those together. And the more congruence, the higher the performance. So that's another value of having this little instrument, is to identify the subcultures as well as the overall culture and what it is at the core that pulls everybody together. All right, now again, I'm spending too much time, but that's one of the implications of this framework, and especially its application to culture.
And it's great. It's your great contribution to the management field. And Professor Dr. Kasımoğlu, would you like to ask a question? He is our management professor as well. Yeah, go.
Yeah, thank you. And it is great honor, Professor Cameron, to be with you. And welcome to our university virtually. It is really very nice hearing. So, Professor, I know that you have making a great research on the also university culture. And as a university academicians, I would like to learn creating an effective learning environment is very important for our job and for our students. So as a university, we want to be also very challenging and demanding a global university. And so what is your suggestions about the culturally oriented and leadership structure of the higher education industry and the universities? So if you can share your opinion, I'll be very appreciative of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Murat. Thank you. Well, for the last 15 or 20 years of my life, that's one of the motivating questions for me. And it's led me into a field of study that we refer to as positive organizational scholarship. And what that means is I've discovered in my own research that organizations can create a learning environment, and organizations can create extraordinary performance if they focus on something that we've simply labeled positive leadership or positive organization culture. Now, I need to take a minute and explain what I mean by that. So think, for example, of a line, just a straight line, anchored on one end, well, let me label that line a deviance continuum. Now, in English, the word deviance has a negative connotation. If I call you a deviant, that's normally a criticism. But deviance just means an aberration from the norm, unexpected, not normal behavior. So you can think of negative deviance, but you can also think of positive deviance. Okay, so there's several important implications of thinking of deviance on a continuum. You notice I'm taking a real side trip, and I'll come back to the question. Several important implications. One implication is that we know a lot more about one end of that continuum than the other. So think, for example, of physical health. On one end of the continuum, let's call it the left-hand side, on one end of that continuum, negatively deviant physical health is illness. I got the flu, I got diabetes, I got COVID, I'm not feeling well. 90% of medical research focuses on the gap between the left-hand side, negative deviance, and the middle. Once I'm absent illness, that is, I'm right smack in the middle, not deviant in any way, medical science essentially stops studying me. I mean, I'm healthy. I get a physical exam once a year, but for the most part, if I'm doing fine, that's where medical science stops. Psychology is very similar. On the left-hand side of that continuum would be negative psychological state, depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and so on, the kinds of things that have emerged in major ways with the COVID pandemic. Well, 95% of psychological research focuses on the gap between the left-hand side and the middle. Once I'm in the middle, which is I'm fine, what's called subjective well-being is fine. Happiness quotient is fine. I'm doing okay. Psychology essentially loses interest. However, on the right-hand side of that continuum, which we refer to as positively deviant performance, physically, that would be, for example, the ability to run an Ironman competition, or to do 400 push-ups, or 5% body fat for men, 15% body fat for women. I mean, extraordinary physical health. Well, a little bit of research, but not much. All right, psychologically, it's very similar. On the right-hand side, a colleague wrote a book, Csikszentmihalyi was his name. We call him Mike Csikszentmihalyi, just passed away this past year. Wrote a book many years ago called Flow. It simply describes a condition where you're so immersed in a task you care about, you lose track of time, you lose track of physiological needs. If you put electrodes on your brain, you're using more of your brain capacity than normal. So it's not zoning out in front of a screen, it's hypercognitive activity. Well, you've had that experience, by the way. A little research on that, not much. Okay, with organizations, it's very similar. Most of the time, in a course, for example, in a class in a business school or psychology or engineering or medicine or something, we hand students a case study. The normal assignment is, what are the problems? What are the obstacles? What are the difficulties? Come up with some recommendations to solve that problem. In other words, we go from the left-hand side to the middle. Ha-ha, we've solved the problem. I mean, we got quality problems, we got customer satisfaction problems, things are not going so well, employees are not satisfied. How do you solve that problem and get this organization to be just fine? Market share is fine, number one in profitability and so on. Well, on the right-hand side is something else. Extraordinary, spectacular performance. And in the last 20 years or so, I've written done several studies describing spectacular, almost unbelievably positive performance. I mean, above industry average by a factor of 5 to 10, for example. People can't hardly believe it. By implementing what I'm referring to as positive practices. In fact, I refer to it as virtuous practices. Because in the original Latin and Greek, virtuousness just means the best of the human condition. The highest aspirations we have for ourselves is a virtuous state. So when you're at your peak, at your very best, that's virtuousness. So as it turns out, there's all kinds of research, a whole bunch of research. I can share in just a minute if you'd like, that suggests when you implement virtuous practices or positive practices, you get extraordinary performance, well above the norm or the mean or the expectation. So in the last 15 or 20 years, one of the applications of that is, well, how do you help students flourish, achieve extraordinary, spectacular results in a classroom? Well, we just finished a study about a year ago in which we took students from around the world, 12 different areas in the world. And here's the study in brief. We took 14 different disciplines. So a faculty member from each of 14 different disciplines. So we had engineering and mathematics and chemistry and so on, all the way to healthcare and psychology and so on, 14 different disciplines. We brought those faculty members together, spent a day or a day and a half with them, exposing them to positive practices and the research that confirms or that proves that implementing these practices makes a difference, has impact on individuals, has impact on organizations. We said, what we'd like to have you do is teach the same class this year that you taught last year. So in accounting, teach accounting, 404, whatever, exactly the same course as last year, but this time implement positive practices in your course. Doesn't mean you have to change the content, just implement positive practices. 14 of these people said, okay, I'll do it. All right. At the end of the next semester, we measured things like student well-being, how much they like the class. I mean, just ratings of the class. 10% increase in student evaluations. We measured student attendance. We got almost a 10% improvement in student attendance in the class. Most importantly, we measured their academic performance, test scores, the extent to which they did well on analyses and so on and so on. Marked improvement, about a half a grade point across the class improvement in how well they learned just by getting exposed to some of these positive practices in their classroom. So I've become convinced that there is a way to improve our performance individually and also organizationally by implementing positive practices, fostering positive leadership, and so on. Now, that said, it's not just a single leader that causes that to happen. Positive leadership can happen at any level in the organization. So that's the summary of what I might suggest to have a university take seriously an improvement in outcomes for students. I'll give you one other study. I have a colleague who was living in Bhutan. He went to the Education Association in Bhutan, asked them if he could impose on the high school curriculum a bunch of positive practices, positive theory and techniques and so on. 11 high schools said yes, 9 high schools said no. Well, that makes a wonderful opportunity to simply contrast control condition versus experimental condition. At the end of 1 year, he measured student well-being, significant improvement in student well-being. And then he measured scores on standardized tests, statistically significant improvement in scores on tests. Those 11 high schools that said yes versus those that said no. Then he went to Mexico, 35 high schools in experimental condition, 35 high schools in the control condition. Same result, actually it was more dramatic result. student well-being, academic performance. Then he went to Peru, 700,000 students involved, 347 high schools in each condition. Bingo, same result. So one very simple way to answer that question, there are lots of ways, but positive practices, as it turns out, it's not a silver bullet, but it turns out to be a pretty powerful intervention.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. It's a great, and I wish I would like to keep in touch and getting a more, benefits from your great, know-how about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're very kind.
Thank you very much, Murat Hoca. Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. I think always would like to ask a question about also positive leadership.
Thank you, Professor. First of all, thank you for this wonderful webinar. Sir, I have a question that what is positive leadership in your mind? What do you think about it? That what is positive leadership and how can it affect the organization performance? Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that question. So, positive leadership is simply, there are several different components that I can talk about. Positive leadership at its very core is leadership that helps other people flourish and helps them reach their potential. Now, that's a very simplistic kind of statement, but what we've ended up doing is, in fact, the book that was just released about a month ago is called Positively Energizing Leadership. And what I did was we interviewed about 600 people, all of whom were identified or recognized as positive leaders. That is, they exuded positive energy, uplifted, elevated people. And we simply asked, what are the behaviors that they display? What are the attributes of these people who have such a positive impact on others? Well, in those interviews, we ended up with a long list, as you might expect. And so I've just highlighted about 15 of those attributes. So one way to think about positive leadership is to think about these attributes. And one of them is simply they help other people flourish without expecting a return, a result, or a reward. It's what moms do with children. Now, I don't need a reward to help my children flourish, same kind of thing. They're people who end up helping other people see a profound purpose in their work. Something more than just, I'm getting a good grade. Is that it? Is that all? Is that the only reason I'm here? And so on. So there's a whole bunch of those, and I'm happy to make those available without just listing them. But maybe the most important part of what I've learned by identifying and studying positive leadership is that every human being, in fact, every living system, from single cell organisms to complex human systems, every human being flourishes in the presence of positive energy and languishes in the presence of negative energy. Now, let me tell you what I mean by that. So that, by the way, the label is called the heliotropic effect. So if you put a plant in the window, over time, it will lean toward the light, which is an example of the heliotropic effect, which, as it turns out, is defined as every living system, everything alive has a tendency toward that which is life-giving. In nature, the sun is a source of positive energy. Photosynthesis happens only in the presence of light. In other words, life will happen only in the presence of light. So as it turns out, human beings, like every other species, have a tendency to live or absorb life from positive energy, and they tend to languish in the presence of negative energy or the absence of light. All right. Well, what we've discovered is if we can create a condition, an environment, a culture that has positive energy as simply part of what happens every day, people flourish. They do a lot better than in a negative. I need to tell you a few stories. I need to tell you a couple of studies to illustrate what I'm talking about. Let me tell you about one that has to do with children. Then I'll tell you what happens in organizations. So in this particular study, they took children ages 3 months to 8 months, just tiny little children. And the study was they put a child on a caregiver's lap. The child watched a puppet show for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. So a puppet tries to walk across the stage, tries to climb a hill, tries to open a box. Then you have 2 other puppets. One puppet tries to help, encourage, support. The other tries to hinder, puts a block up, you can't make it up the hill, jumps on the box, you can't open the box, something. Then after 20 or 30 seconds, you bring these 2 puppets out, put it in front of the child, and the child can select whichever puppet he or she wants to play with. Now at 3 months, you can't grab, they're too young. So they measure eye movement. Which one does the child focus on and desire? More than 90% of the time, children select the puppet that tries to help rather than tries to hinder. And the conclusion of that study, which has been replicated many times, the conclusion of that study is from the time you were 3 months old, there is an inherent tendency toward virtuousness, toward the positive, and away from the reverse. It's inherent in the human condition before we're socialized, before we learn language, before we are old enough to know what a good relationship is. That is inherent in the human condition is this tendency toward positive virtuousness. All right. What we've done in this research is not only, there's lots of studies on brain scans, on heart rhythms, on something called congruence. It's the extent to which your body is aligned. Your heart rhythm, your brain rhythms, your muscle twitch rhythms are all aligned. When that's the case, you're significantly better off, and so on. But what I've done is ask the question, yeah, but does this actually have any impact on organizations? Because it's not unusual to have me run into an executive or senior leadership team or something in an organization and have them say something like this. Look, Cameron, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're struggling with market share and supply chain issues and resignation of all kinds of people. And so we're short-staffed and board people are really burned out in our organization. And not only that, but I've got to pay attention to stock price and profitability and so on. And you're telling me, just think happy thoughts. Baloney. That's just it's irrelevant. Not only that, it makes me mad, frankly. If you could show me how this pays off for what I'm accountable for, I might pay attention to it. Otherwise, hey, this is a feel-good side trip. So what I've been doing for 20 years is try to make the case that this actually has an impact on what leaders are held accountable for. So, for example, we took one example is healthcare organizations, hospitals. We intervened in those hospitals and showed them or exposed them to a whole bunch of different positive practices, positive leadership activities, and so on. And then we measured 9 dimensions of outcome over a 2-year period of time because we wanted to make sure it was a causal relationship that we were measuring. And what we discovered is if they improved in positive practices over a 2-year period of time on 9 different dimensions, their improvement was in the upper 20s and mid 30% improvement. In an industry where the average improvement is 3%, we were getting 10 times industry average in these organizations. And we said, okay, well, you might expect that in healthcare, but let's find an industry where you would never expect this. So we picked financial services. I mean, if I'm in a Wall Street firm, I don't care how you manage. I just need a return on my investment. I mean, if I've got $100 billion invested in that portfolio, I want to know if it's going up or down in 15 minutes. I don't care how you manage it. I just want a return. So we took 40 financial services firms where we knew all they cared about was money. Same kind of intervention. We spent a day and a half or so with them, explained how you can implement positive practices, positive leadership. And then we did the same thing over a 2-year period of time. There's a statistic called R square. It means the amount of variance accounted for. We could account for 45% of the profitability in those firms on the basis of just whether or not they were improving in their positive leadership and positive practices or not. I mean, do you know anything that predicts the stock market by 45%? It was an enormously strong prediction. And it not only predicted financial performance in those firms, but engagement of employees, turnover, customer satisfaction, and so on. In other words, there's really strong empirical evidence that suggests when you implement these positive practices, not only do people do better, feel better, but the organization's bottom line is significantly impacted. And you can understand why that's the case. Now, I've talked too long and we only have, I think, 5 minutes left. So let me stop. Stop talking.
Thank you very much. Ola, would you like to ask a question? These are our PhD students, and they're very happy that they met with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, I would like, first of all, like to thank your professor for you joining us today. And basically, I would like to ask you about the organizational downsizing. If you please could define the organizational downsizing. And I would like to know let's say when or in which circumstances an organization should be downsized. In addition to the advantages and the disadvantages of the downsizing.
Say one more time, advantages or disadvantages of what, Ola?
The same topic, the downsizing, organizational downsizing. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thank you for that wonderful question. So for about 10 years, I was doing research on downsizing. Downsizing really means cutting the budget, consolidating, laying off people, and so on. It's something that is, again, a really prominent issue as a result of the pandemic, that many organizations have had to lay off lots and lots of people. Well, the results of my research, which has been confirmed by many, many others, is that 80 or so percent, maybe a little bit more than 80% of organizations that downsize deteriorate in performance. I mean, profitability, morale, market share, trust, collaboration, all kinds of things diminish in the organization, and therefore performance also does. So downsizing and negative outcomes in performance are almost always highly correlated. By the way, that leaves 10 or 15% that flourish after downsizing. And that phenomenon is what led me into this notion of positive leadership and positive practices, is that I began asking the question, how do you explain that small number that gets better and everybody else that doesn't? And what I discovered is, or what I concluded is, those organizations that flourished were characterized by gratitude and compassion and generosity, forgiveness, and virtuousness. Okay, but downsizing ends up being one of those attributes that is so common because it's the easiest strategy to implement. Holy cow, the budget's we're not meeting goals or expectations, we're not making as much money as we wanted to, we better cut headcount. So as it turns out, one of the studies I did was a study of organizations of entire industry. The entire industry downsized. It was the airline industry in the United States after 9/11. Now, after the trade towers came down, it was against the law to fly any place in the world for about the next 3 days, because the assumption was that airplanes were being used as bombs. So nobody wants to get on an airplane. Well, after several days, people began flying again, but ridership topped out at 80% of previous ridership levels, which is fine, except that the economic model of the US airline industry is based on 86% seat fill rate. So if you top out at 80%, you're going to lose money. So 7 airline companies in America declared bankruptcy. All right. The 2 airline companies that were hurt the worst were what are called short haul carriers. They're the airlines that depend mostly on very short flights. One of them was called US Airways, dependent on an average flight was about 500 miles. The other one was called Southwest Airlines. The average flight was 400 miles. So people began saying, I think maybe I'll take the train. I don't think I'll take that short flight. I think maybe I'll drive to my destination. I don't think I'm going to take a shuttle, and so on. So they were hurt worse. Well, these 2 particular companies, these short haul carriers, approached this strategy in a very, very different way. One of them said, we're going to declare financial exigency, which means all union contracts are null and void. So we're going to lay off 25% of our employees, no severance, no benefits. The other short haul carrier, on the other hand, said, we're going to lay off no one. Now, wait a minute. This is a publicly traded firm. You're going to lay off no one. That's not fiscally responsible. So I interviewed the CEO and I said, what's the rationale? He said, look, not furloughing people. He said, look, we can't continue to do this forever. Of course not. But at least for now, not laying people off builds loyalty, breeds a sense of security, breeds a sense of trust, builds a sense of camaraderie among our company where people are willing to sacrifice for one another. And we're not going to do this forever, but we think we're going to be advantaged by being as virtuous as we can possibly be with our employees. Well, we did a study and we published it in an academic journal where we simply measured the financial return, essentially stock price, financial return based on the virtuousness of the downsizing strategies. And I've only talked about these 2 firms, but we could sort of categorize across 9 different companies in terms of how sensitive they were to human beings, to not lying and cheating and so on. The correlation between the virtuousness of the downsizing strategy and financial return was 0.86. It was almost perfect. The more virtuous the company, the more money they made. Virtuousness was the major predictor of financial return. So, bottom line from that research is, the time will come when you can't ignore the environment forever. Of course not. But certainly in the short term, not furloughing people, not laying off people, is often it's costly in the short run, but really beneficial in the long run. At least in that industry, financial performance just far outstripped the rest of the industry among those that were mainly taking into account the well-being of their employees. Now, fast forward to the pandemic. I know companies who have done almost exactly the same thing, some that slashed and burned almost from the outset, versus others that said, look, what we need to do is have everybody take a 10% pay cut. The senior executives are going to take a 25% pay cut. We're going to try as best we can to preserve the jobs of our people. As it turns out, when you look back at who has flourished, who's recovered quickly after the downside, after the pandemic, and those that have adopted a more virtuous strategy tend, on the average, to do better. Now, I don't have specific data like the 0.86 correlation, but downsizing, as it turns out, has to occur in some organizations. But people, here's the major point, people should not be the first option. There are hidden costs in every organization. I spend time with several major corporations now, and one of the exercises I ask them to do is to identify at least a 1% improvement in hidden or unacknowledged costs. And we take them through a little process where they try to identify those. Well, as it turns out, in one case, there's a team of about 20 people. They saved $100 million by identifying something nobody had ever thought about. They just got rid of stuff they didn't need to get rid of. They combined a bunch of things that they didn't think they didn't have to be separate. So lots of duplication were eliminated and so on. So my prescription for downsizing has to do with people last, hidden costs first. Now I've gone on too long. Let me stop. Wonderful question, Ola. Thank you.
Can we say organizational virtuousness is being responsible to our employees?
Virtuousness certainly has to do with being responsible to and responsible for employees. In addition to that, it goes beyond that. I mean, when I measure virtuousness in an organization, I measure about 8 dimensions. Here are the dimensions. I'm not sure you care about these. One dimension is the extent to which the organization has embedded or implemented practices that display gratitude and appreciation for employees. I mean, not a big deal, but there's one study that shows that the average employee, only 10% of employees express gratitude to a colleague once a week, and 60% never express gratitude to a colleague in their work. So the organizations that have lots and lots of opportunities to express thanks and gratitude, appreciation, recognition to people, that's one dimension. Another dimension, the extent to which the organization has an environment that prioritizes respect and dignity, the extent to which I feel like I'm valued, I'm not harassed, I'm not denigrated, I can come to work and I sort of can fulfill my potential. So dignity and respect is another. The third, the extent to which the organization is characterized by compassion and support. Now, it turns out I've read this kind of research, maybe 5 or 6 different studies. Take any group of people, more than 50% of them will be struggling with some very significant, painful experience, a major challenge in their life. So compassion is almost always relevant or helpful because it's going to be meaningful to somebody, and probably more than 50%. So compassion is relevant only when people are struggling and suffering, but most people are. So the extent to which the organization itself, and there's lots of examples of this. I won't take time to tell you the stories, but lots of examples of organizations that help people feel like they've got a support system. Another dimension, extent to which people feel like they are important, they're valued. They have, excuse me, they have colleagues who support them, and they have an environment where, for the most part, they feel cared for. Not surprising, I mean, that's what we do with our children. In fact, in the absence of that, children really struggle psychologically for most of the rest of their life. And another, the extent to which there is meaningfulness and purpose in what the organization is doing, or what the tasks are, or what the job is. So one of the tools we created is something called job crafting. It's simply a way to take whatever job you have and craft it into a way that becomes meaningful, has importance beyond just my own reward. So organizations that have a real sense of purpose and meaning, it's not only meaning, but the extent to which it feels like there's something important. I need to give you another study. We did a study of hospital custodians, cleaners, the lowest possible status in the hospitals. One of the women was assigned to the oncology ward. That's the ward where you get chemotherapy. So these people are the sickest they'll ever be, absolutely at the bottom in terms of their health, because you almost have to kill people to kill the cancer cells. Well, these people are vomiting, losing control of their bowels, embarrassed, feeling just terrible. This woman, custodian, said in the interviews, she said, I believe my job is at least as important as the physicians, maybe more so. Because she said these people are at their very bottom. They're feeling terrible. I can help lift them. I can help them heal. I can help them feel better. I can be here for them. That, she said, is at least as important as the guy who's putting a needle in their arm. Now, if you can find profound purpose in cleaning up vomit, you can find it in almost anything. It's not the nature of the task at all. It's the way you define how important is this? Am I making a difference in somebody else's life that matters a lot? All right, that's what that means. All right.
Okay, thank you.
And so on. I mean, there's some others. The positive energy, the extent to which positive energy and inspiration are present, that's another dimension we measure. Forgiveness and understanding. When you make mistakes, you define those as learning opportunities rather than career-ending mistakes or bloopers or something. And then the last one is trust and integrity. The extent to which the organization is based on that kind of thing. All right, now, when those 8 dimensions are in place, that's when you get 10 times industry average. Because, well, for all kinds of reasons. It's heliotropic. People tend to resonate with that. They tend to collaborate when instead of being in conflict, and so on. So I'm talking too much, but that's those are the dimensions. So when those are in place, you don't have to downsize people, at least as a first alternative.
Okay, thank you. Özgür, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you, Hocam. Good day, sir. I am one of the PhD students in the university, and thank you very much for the webinar today. My question is about organizational effectiveness. How can companies assess, evaluate organizational effectiveness and increase it?
So it's a wonderful question. My doctoral dissertation was entitled, I don't remember what it was entitled, something about organizational effectiveness in institutions of higher education. And it was a study of, well, how do you measure organizational effectiveness? The problem with that term, organizational effectiveness, is that it has essentially been abandoned in organization theory. That is, organizational effectiveness originally, when I was studying it in a university could be defined by 9 different dimensions. Well, a number of people, scholars in our field, essentially said the problem is organizational effectiveness is too broad a term. It incorporates or encompasses too many things. So we've got to start narrowing it down. And so instead of measuring organizational effectiveness, let's measure student well-being. Let's measure profitability. Let's measure stock price. Let's measure, whatever, customer satisfaction. So dividing that up. When people use organizational effectiveness, they end up saying, here is what I'm talking about. And there are a variety of different dimensions or models of effectiveness. One way to think about effectiveness is to say, we are achieving our goals. If we achieve our goals, that means we're effective. So we have a goal of, number 1 market share. We have a goal of being number 1 in the industry or whatever. Okay, we achieved it. That means we're effective. That's one model or one major well-accepted definition. Another one has to do with another definition, another model, another way people define that term. We are gaining the resources we need. That is, we need, in some cases, revenues, profitability. We need good employees, social capital. We need customer satisfaction, and so on. Whatever, we've just identified the resources we need. And if we get those resources, if we can achieve those resources, that means we're effective. So that's another framework, a goal, a model that people have in their minds. A third, I'm going to give you 4. Actually, I'm going to give you 4 and then a summary. A third has to do with if we are compatible, everybody's happy, our organization is flourishing because people are collaborating, the organization is absent conflict. I mean, people feel like well-being is a high priority and we're really meeting those needs. That's another model or definition of effectiveness. Essentially it's the human capital is being most effectively managed. And then a fourth has to do, it's called a strategic constituency model. Essentially, it says there are some people more important than others in the survival and performance of this organization, like shareholders, like customers. If we maximize our response to the strategic constituencies, that is, those people, there may be others who don't like us so much, but if we have met the aspiration or expectation of our strategic constituencies, that means we're effective. Okay. Well, those are the 4 major models that sort of dominated the literature. One of the advantages now of the competing values framework that we started with is that it actually helps summarize those various models. And so we essentially say there's no one model that takes priority over others, but rather you can identify a package. Of course, we have to have strategic constituencies satisfied, but we can't do that at the expense of collaboration and so on. We can't do that at the expense of making a well-oiled system that's achieving its goals, and so on and so on. So the competing values framework has turned out in the scholarly literature frequently to be a summary of the effectiveness of the organizational effectiveness models. And you can kind of pinpoint where those are in that competing values framework. So, summary. Effectiveness has become a bit passé. My doctoral dissertation, nobody cares about that anymore. It was old. But it's sort of been replaced by something that's pretty useful, which is a competing values framework. I edited a book quite a few years ago now called Organizational Effectiveness, and it summarizes all those frameworks, all those models, and essentially what we know about organizational effectiveness.
Thank you.
It's boring, by the way. It's very boring.
Thank you. Hamidettin, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Professor. My question is, how can a leader be effective, especially during turbulent times?
I'm sorry, one more time.
How can a leader be effective, especially during turbulent times?
I'm still not sure.
Listen to me.
I apologize.
He's asking, how can a leader be effective, especially during turbulent times?
Thank you, thank you. I'm sorry, thank you. Sometimes it's a little fuzzy to hear, sorry. Well, turbulent times almost always help bring out the very core of who a leader is and what a leader cares about. When the environment is stable and benign or benevolent, when everything is going well, I mean, think of your families. When the children all behave, you got enough money in the bank, everything's going well. I mean, it's easy to be whatever, behave in almost whatever way you want to behave, and that works out fine. And organizations is very much the same. That is, we talk about positive leadership or benevolent leadership or servant leadership or transformational leadership, or there's a whole bunch of ways to think about leadership. And when everything is fine, I can experiment, I can be whatever I want. But what happens under turbulent times, under uncertainty, they call it VUCA, volatile, uncertain, chaotic environment, ambiguous. When those conditions exist, then almost always a leader becomes who he or she really is. And you sort of revert back to first learned, most reinforced behaviors. It's called the threat rigidity response. When people get threatened, they're in a really ambiguous environment, don't know where to go. They tend, it's called threat rigidity, they tend to get rigid. Or in other words, rely on first learned, most reinforced behaviors. I've got to give you an example. So this was 20 years ago, 30 years ago maybe. The fighter aircraft flown by NATO forces was exactly the same as the fighter aircraft flown by the United States Air Force, except for one design difference. In the NATO version, European version of the plane, the ejection system went out the bottom of the plane. So if you got yourself in trouble and had to eject, pilots were trained to flip the plane over and eject so you could go up and have enough time for your parachute to open and come down. In the US version of the plane, the ejection system went out the top of the plane. So it's a small explosion. You have to get up there before the tail comes and cuts you in half. All right. There are 9 recorded cases of a pilot having trained in Europe, coming to the United States, flying the US version of the plane, getting himself in trouble, flipping the plane over, and ejecting himself into the ground, killing himself. 9 recorded cases. Why is that? Because ambiguous, difficult, chaotic conditions. First learned most reinforced behavior. I learned to eject myself by flipping that plane over, and I did it again, only this time I'm in the US version, and the people eject themselves into the ground. All right, there are lots of examples of threat rigidity. So leadership in turbulent times almost always will bring out the first learned, most reinforced behaviors, the habitual behaviors. That's who the person really is. That means before I ever get myself in turbulent, difficult VUCA conditions, I need to have practiced what I really want to be. That's one of the reasons I'm championing the idea of being a positive leader, developing virtuous behaviors. It's just who I am. It's what I do. Even when things get chaotic, my first response isn't to cut headcount or some other thing that's not helpful for the organization. I have a little principle that I teach. I've been teaching for the last 15 years. And it's called a 1% principle. And what I normally encourage executives to do is to select 1% improvement. That's it, 1%. Anybody can do that. Well, here's why it's important. If you get in an airplane in, for example, Istanbul, you go around the world, but you're off 1 degree. You end up in southern Egypt or in northern Germany. In fact, you probably end up in northern Denmark. Just 1 degree off. That is 1% over time puts you in a very different place. So pick 1%, improve, 1% improvement, and simply apply it. Apply it for 3 weeks and it'll be part of what you do. So anybody can improve 1%. And when you think about a top management team, everybody picks 1%. I mean, if there are a dozen people in the top management team, when's the last time you saw 12% improvement in anything? So everybody picks 1%, you're getting a big improvement. All right, so the whole point is, especially in turbulent times, if people will have picked 1% before that hits them, before the crisis comes, they'll be where they want to be. All right, now we're out of time. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Humaira, would you like to ask a question? We have actually like 5 minutes, okay? These are our last questions because this is Ramadan in Turkey and it's, iftar time is approaching, okay? So yeah, Humaira, please go
ahead. Thank you, Professor. And hello, everyone. I'm following Dr. Oasis' question, actually. I wonder that what is relational energy and what is its difference than other energy types, especially for a leader, such as positive energy? Thank you.
Thank you. Bless your hearts. These are wonderful questions. Thank you. So there are lots of kinds of energy. One kind of energy is called physical energy, which when I use it, it diminishes. For example, if I run a marathon, I can't do it again. I have to have recovery time. I'm going to get exhausted. So I got to have some recuperation. Mental energy is another kind of energy. It's the kind of energy we use when you take exams and you write papers. I mean, we need weekends. We need semester breaks to just kind of reinvigorate ourselves. Another kind of energy is called emotional energy. Again, when it's used, it diminishes. So I'm in an intense interaction, in a debate, or whatever. I'm using emotional energy, even when it's positive. I go to an athletic event and cheer and scream and so on. I'm tired at the end. The only kind of energy that elevates with use is relational energy. It's the kind of energy that is exchanged between two people. Positive leaders, for example, positively energizing leaders, are simply people who help other people flourish. As it turns out, we never get exhausted by being around people with whom we have loving, supportive relationships. In fact, when I get exhausted, I often seek out a person with whom I have a positively energizing relationship in order to be renewed. So positive relational energy is the energy that occurs in an interaction with another human being. And there are lots of examples of how that happens, and no time to talk about that. But relational energy matters a lot. It's a major predictor of performance. It certainly is a predictor of the renewal of a human being. And as it turns out, positive relational energy is more important, and this is the last thing I'll say, is more important in predicting life expectancy, for example, than is being overweight. If you're overweight, the probability of dying early is 20%. If you're an excessive drinker of alcohol, probability of dying early is 30%. If you're a smoker, tobacco, marijuana, probability of dying early is 50%. If you're in poor social relationships, probability of dying early is 70%. It trumps the physical factors that we normally spend so much time with. Well, how do you make sure that relationships are not life depleting, but life enhancing, positively energizing relationships are the key. Positive relational energy is the key. So part of this book that I just finished is, a large part of the book has to do with fostering, enabling, creating positive relational energy. Thanks for the question.
Okay, our last two questions. They're asking from the YouTube, what kind of organizational culture and leadership style will be more appropriate during COVID-19? Because most of the employees are working remotely, and so how could leaders manage these employees?
So one of the nice things about the competing values framework is there's no such thing as a right answer or a best culture profile or a best leadership type. Not at all. So it's not prescriptive. The only kind of leadership that I would actually prescribe, regardless of who you are or where you are, is this positive. I just happen to have this book here, so I shouldn't hold it up, but positive relational energy, which essentially is the kind of energy that renews us individually and the people with whom we're around. That would be the prescription that I would have for every leader. And so far, I could be way off base, but so far I don't know any environment or any institution or any situation where it doesn't help people flourish, where it doesn't work. Does that make sense? Is that did I reply to the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And what might be the possible research areas for the professors? What can you suggest to us?
For areas of research, did you say?
Yeah. What might be the potential research areas for this new era?
Well, I have my entire career has always been focused on problem-centered research rather than theoretical research or theory-building research. So I have a great deal of admiration and respect for people whose research is focused on building theory about something. And there are lots of those. And that's great. But I've always, my own work has always been driven by, gee, I see something that I don't understand. It's a problem that occurs. I think maybe I'll study that. So for example, my very first piece of research was, how do you assess and how would you improve the effectiveness of a college or university? Nobody knew how to do that. That was my first. Another set of studies had to do with downsizing. A whole bunch of organizations are downsizing. And the trouble is almost all of them are going south in terms of performance. Well, how do you do it in a way that enhances performance? And then it led me into this idea of positive leadership. How do you get organizations to go from we're doing fine to we're extraordinary, we're spectacular? So I just have a bias toward having people find things that are interesting, but that we don't know, we don't have an answer for, or we don't know how to solve that problem. And in my case, boy, there are long lists of those things that we just don't know yet. So that would be my prescription. I am not in the norm in terms of giving that kind of advice, but that's where I think we ought to be spending at least some of our time. And the reason is people in leadership positions don't read our stuff. That's too esoteric. I mean, we don't read our stuff. You know, the average journal article gets read by about a half a dozen people. So.
Okay. We received the last question. How long does it take to change a dominant culture? And is it possible to change dominant organizational culture without changing subcultures?
That's a very long topic to discuss. My answer is, it is possible to change organizational culture. It's not easy. It's really difficult. I told you that little story about the fellow in the auto company who said, I'm going to leave my business card underneath the windshield wiper. I'm going to change the whole way I think about what I'm doing. That's possible, but very difficult to do. But that's how organizations become spectacular. And I just feel like, and this is the last thing I'll say, I just feel like I would bet my money on instituting positive or virtuous practices as a key way to change culture, because all human beings at their very core resonate with, respond to virtuousness. Everybody responds to caring, generosity, kindness, forgiveness, and so on. It's a matter of fostering that in an organization. Now, there's much more to say about that, because one reaction is, oh, that's soupy, syrupy, baloney. That's grandmother's advice. But my own research has been trying to focus on and provide the business case for, here's when it works, and here's the evidence that it does work. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. It was our pleasure to meet with you, and I hope we will see you in our university. And Elçin Hoca, I think she's going to make a closing speech. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
To see you in our webinar. Elçin Hoca, buyurun.
Wonderful questions, wonderful group. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. It's a great pleasure for us to hear all those theories and studies from your mouth. We learn and remember so many things with you. Thank you very much. And as Professor Karabult also mentioned, we will be glad to see you in Istanbul and in our university.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening.